Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most wild and dramatic paradoxes in modern history. Following the Cold War, Europe found itself at a profound crossroads. We're going to look at two drastically contrasting paths that were unfolding at the exact same time: the violent, heartbreaking collapse of a federation in the East and the highly ambitious, heavily bureaucratic integration of a union in the West.
So, looking back at the 1990s and 2000s, we really have to ask ourselves a foundational question. How on earth did toxic nationalism completely tear apart Yugoslavia while literally right next door, a slow, methodical, and peaceful process of integration built the massive European Union? It is a fascinating tale of two completely different political realities.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll look at the two paths for modern Europe: the collapse of Yugoslavia, the resulting nationalism and wars, the simultaneous push for EU integration, the failed European Constitution, and finally, the pivot to the Lisbon Treaty. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. Two paths for modern Europe, state building versus state breaking.
These two paths absolutely defined the continent after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Think about it. We're looking at two entirely different mechanisms of change playing out on the same continent in the exact same era. On one hand, you've got the total fragmentation of Yugoslavia, a disintegration driven almost entirely by ethnic nationalism and populist demagogues. And on the flip side, the European Union is undergoing this complex, highly legal evolution, trying to unify sovereign states through economic and political treaties. Same continent, completely different trajectories. Moving on to part 2. The collapse of Yugoslavia, an economic and political unraveling. This whole unraveling really kicks off after Yugoslavia's longtime authoritarian leader, Tito, dies in 1980. This leaves a massive political vacuum. And the stakes? Immediate and devastating. Take a look at this number. By 1989, the Yugoslav economy was slammed by a staggering 1,240% annual inflation rate. I mean, wow. While every Eastern Bloc nations dealt with the 80s economic crisis by borrowing foreign cash, the leadership in Belgrade just kept printing more of their own money. This hurled the country into crippling hyperinflation, and you could imagine how that bred deep resentment in the wealthier republics, like Croatia and Slovenia. They felt their economic futures were basically being tanked by corruption in the capital. Right into this massive economic void steps Slobodan Milosevic. Making his move in his native Serbia, he launches a ruthless bid for power by dialing up Serb nationalist emotions. He forces through amendments to absorb the autonomous provinces of Kosovo and Vojvodina, while also securing the loyalty of Montenegro. Why does this matter? Well, this gives Milosevic control over 4 of the 8 federal votes in Yugoslavia. It's almost like a hostile corporate takeover from within. He effectively hijacked the entire federal system, creating a permanent stalemate. For republics like Slovenia and Croatia, the writing was clearly on the wall. They simply couldn't protect their interests within a totally dysfunctional system controlled from Belgrade. Part 3. Nationalism and the Yugoslav Wars. The price paid at home. Unlike other post-communist nations that transitioned politically by focusing on, say, democratization or privatization, Yugoslavia's politicians leaned hard into the ethnic card, and it led straight to full-scale war. Because the populations in Yugoslavia were so deeply intermingled, breaking up the federation meant huge minority groups would be left stranded in newly independent states. This triggered a rapid, devastating chain of conflicts. It starts with a brief clash in Slovenia in 1991, followed by a much bloodier war in Croatia. Then comes the incredibly brutal Bosnian War from 92 to 95, right in an area where ethnic and religious communities were interwoven like a patchwork quilt. Finally, having lost basically everywhere else, Milosevic turns his forces on the Albanian population in Kosovo in 1999, which only ends when NATO intervenes. The sheer brutality of these wars really cannot be overstated. A lot of the fighting wasn't even regular armies clashing. It was done by irregular militias. And their primary strategic goal wasn't just to defeat the enemy militarily. It was what became known as ethnic cleansing. This is the absolutely horrific practice of expelling non-Serb citizens from their homes and lands just to claim that territory. Now, while militias on all sides engaged in this, the history shows that Serb forces were the primary offenders here, heavily relying on neighbors literally turning on neighbors. The human toll of this nationalist disintegration was just massive: 3 million people. To put that into perspective, that was 1 in 8 of the pre-war population, fleeing as refugees in just the first year of the wars in Croatia and Bosnia alone. It was an absolute humanitarian disaster, unfolding in real time on television screens all over the globe. All right, let's shift gears to part 4, the push for EU integration, the bureaucratic corridors of Brussels. The scale of the contrast between East and West at this exact moment is just mind-blowing. As Yugoslavia is literally breaking apart into smaller and smaller pieces, just a few hundred miles away, the European Union is rapidly absorbing new member states. The Union grew from just 6 founding nations in 1952, which initially just focused on coal and steel, expanding all the way to 27 member states by 2007. They successfully created a massive single market of 500 million people. So how do you manage that kind of massive growth? Well, European leaders didn't use force. They relied on the rule of law. Member states were voluntarily handing over parts of their power to centralized institutions, chasing this decades-long quest for unity. They pushed through a series of highly complex treaties that steadily expanded the Union's supranational power. You had the Single European Act in '86, pushing for an internal market. Then the massive Master Treaty in '92, officially establishing the EU and setting up the euro. After that, the Amsterdam and Nice treaties came along to adapt the institutions to handle the huge wave of new Eastern European member states. Part 5. The Failed European Constitution. The Democratic Pushback. But listen, this relentless push for integration couldn't just go on unchecked forever. By 2004, the original treaties had been amended so many times that they were nearly 2,800 pages long. To clean this up, leaders drafted a single, unified constitutional treaty. They split it into 4 distinct parts, hoping to make the Union more readable for everyday citizens. Part I summarized the Union's values in just 60 articles, making it super accessible. On paper, it looked like a total bureaucratic triumph. However, there was a growing, serious disconnect between the politicians drafting these treaties and the actual public they were serving. Just look at the voter turnout for the European Parliament elections. It steadily dropped from 63% in 1979 down to just under 50% by 1999, and it just kept falling. European citizens were clearly feeling more and more alienated from the whole integration project. And this public disengagement eventually triggered a massive political earthquake. In the spring of 2005, the new treaty was finally put to the public, and voters in France and the Netherlands, 2 of the original founding members, mind you, outright rejected the constitutional treaty in national referendums. This killed the Constitution dead in its tracks and sent massive shockwaves straight through Brussels. The crucial point here is understanding why they voted no. The answer lies in a profound misunderstanding, mostly driven by the symbolic words the politicians chose to use. The legal reality was that this was still just a treaty between sovereign states, basically consolidating rules that already existed. It wasn't creating some new superstate. But the public perception? Totally different story. By calling it a constitution and slapping on state-like symbols, talking about European laws, a foreign minister, a flag, an anthem, it completely freaked citizens out. They thought they were losing their national sovereignty. The psychological shock of those symbols heavily outweighed the actual legal reality. Part 6. The Pivot to Lisbon, Salvaging the Union. Following these disastrous negative referendums, European leaders entered a forced period of reflection. And the clock was ticking down to figure out how to salvage the entire integration project before the 2009 European elections. This panic culminated in the 2007 Berlin Declaration. Marking the 50th anniversary of the original treaties of Rome, leaders urgently committed to renewing the political shape of Europe, agreeing to get the Union back on a common basis to avoid total stagnation. The ultimate solution was the Lisbon Treaty. The strategy here was incredibly pragmatic. Ditch the provocative constitution terminology and all those state-like symbols that scared the voters away. They made sure to address the specific concerns of more skeptical states like the UK and Poland. But crucially, under the hood, they kept the institutional reforms they absolutely needed to run a giant 27-member union. And perhaps the most strategic move of all, they structured it as a traditional amending treaty, specifically to avoid triggering new risky referendums wherever politically possible. It was a calculated retreat from grand symbolism right back to the safety of complex bureaucracy. So we've explored 2 massive extremes today. On one side, the tragic, violent shattering of Yugoslavia, fueled by toxic, unchecked nationalism. On the other, the incredibly complex, bureaucratic compromises of the European Union trying to peacefully glue 27 nations together. Both paths really expose the deep tension at the very heart of modern geopolitics. And it leaves us with a huge provocative question about Europe's future. Can a continent forever balance that deep-seated human urge for national sovereignty with the absolute economic and political necessity of supranational unity? It's a question that defines modern politics, and definitely one that leaves us all wanting to explore even more. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.